You're listening to City of Muses on Paris Underground Radio. Welcome to the Season 2 premiere of City of Muses on Paris Underground Radio. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity. I'm a screenwriter, filmmaker, and the creator and founder of the Paris Underground Radio podcast network. Each week, I sit down with an artist or creative to talk about what inspires them, what their creative process is like, and how Paris plays into it all. This week, I have the honor of speaking with internationally renowned artist Yashua Klos, an American artist whose work features his own woodblock printing techniques and collage to create large-scale, gorgeous pieces, often expressing his ideas on family, identity, and the African-American experience. Yashua's newest collection, Building Our Being, is currently being exhibited at the Zidoun-Bossuyt Gallery in Paris' 6th arrondissement. I highly encourage you to put on your shoes, slip in your headphones, and listen to our conversation as you make your way over to see the pieces in person. Hello, Yashua. It's so nice to meet you. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, Jennifer, great to do this. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. Can you tell our audience a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. I'm an artist, first and foremost. In fact, that's kind of the one thing I've always known that I was an artist. And I didn't know what that meant to be a professional artist as a kid, but that didn't matter back then. It just mattered to me that I had a love for drawing and for creating cartoon characters and stories, and that evolved into other kinds of making. And, I have done sculptures and painting, and now I'm doing a lot of woodblock printing and collage. But that is, I think, the one identifying term about myself that I always can say and lay claim to without pause is that I'm an artist.
I was going to ask you if there was a moment where you remember defining yourself in that way. Like there was a moment where you said, when I grow up, this is what I'm going to be. This is who I am.
Yeah. So for me, it was defined by others around me first. So I remember having an experience as a young kid. I was that kid in class that when it was time to do the art project, the other kids would lean over to my table and they would look over my shoulder and watch what I was drawing. And then they would try to barter and trade or, get my drawings. And that's when I knew I had an ability that others couldn't do. I was able to do something special. And they sort of crowned me as an artist first. And my mother as well. My mother and her friends, who were like my aunts, who would take turns taking care of me because my mother was a single parent mom and she worked hard. So it was a lot for her to take care of me on her own. So she had a community of other single parent moms who they would trade off their children to one another for the weekend. But they would always leave paper and crayons or markers for me. And they always just knew that as a kid, I was very quiet and I was always drawing. So they're shocked now that I speak.
And is your mom artistic? Do you come from an artistic family?
My mom, she draws very good stick figures and doodles. And she has beautiful handwriting, but she's not an artist. She's a public school teacher. My father is surely who I got the genes from to be an artist. And I have recently reconnected with my father's side of the family. So they keep telling me stories about my dad's artistry. He was a carpenter. He was a builder. He worked with his hands all the time building. And allegedly he did a painting or two here or there. But I'm pretty sure that that's where I got it from.
That's really interesting. It's exactly the opposite in my family. My mom is an artist and I'm really good at stick figures.
Oh, good.
To her constant disappointment. It's interesting that your father was a carpenter and a woodworker, and here you are working with woodblock printing. Was that something that evolved before you knew that he had this history, or did you know that as well?
Yeah, so I always knew this. That was one of the things that my mother shared with me early on was that my father was a carpenter. He was great with his hands with working, and that he was a hustler. So if he didn't know how to do a job, that wouldn't stop him from getting hired to do the job. He would figure it out on the spot. And I think I kind of got some of that attitude from him as well. The kind of impromptu learning how to respond to new materials and new environments. But I think not as much my woodblock printing, but my sculptures are also, I think, kind of a reference to what I understand of my father's woodworking. They are my first attempts to like work with wood. So in some ways, it is sort of homage to him. The woodblock prints also, a lot of my images are of portraits of family members or of people. And you'll see that what I'm proposing in the images is that they're kind of made out of wood. So the woodblock prints have a wood grain to them that create all the surfaces in their face and body. So some of that is actually kind of about my ineptitude because I cannot build anything like that in 3D. So the 2D becomes a way to imagine what it would be like to build those. And in some ways that's about my disconnection from my father, because he would have been able to build them perhaps, or he would have been able to maybe teach me how. And I didn't get that from him because I was not raised with him. So a lot of my work is about that kind of relationship of being of estrangement from family, but then also reconnection and using my art to bridge the gaps between myself and my family members.
That's really interesting. When you're creating, is your family involved at all in the process? Like, do you share with them as you're going along and show them pieces?
Yeah, I usually don't. I'm one of these stubborn artists. I don't really like ask for much input while I'm in the zone making, but I am asking them often for photos of themselves. If I find a photo of them online that I like, I'll text it to them, ask for their permission or how they feel about it. And now they know what I do. They're so well aware of my process that now they just give me photos. I don't even ask anymore. They just start flooding me with like all these old family photos, and I'm getting obituaries and all kinds of like amazing family histories and documents from them. So I'm so grateful that they want to be a part of what I do.
Yeah. Well, they get to put their sort of fingerprint on the project as well in that way.
I think they see me as kind of the storyteller of the family, that I have the opportunity to share family stories, and tell a story that they have not told otherwise. So it's a privilege that to be able to do that, and that they trust me with it and want to continue to fuel me and be a part of it. I'm so grateful for that.
That's really beautiful. I was going to ask you about the wood blocks too, and the grain of the wood. Does it inform the way that the picture is created?
Right. So I should say that the wood grain that you're seeing is a false wood grain. I'm carving that out of MDF wood. And MDF wood is a composite wood. It's made from sawdust and binder. And I'm carving in the wood grain. And I'm doing that because what I want to do is use woodblock printing in a new way that deviates from tradition. So, for example, the Japanese woodblock printers in the 1700s and 1800s, Hokusai, Hiroshi-J, those legends, they were using the wood grain, actual real wood, and they wanted the wood grain to be a part of the image. So I'm carving the wood grain also as a tribute to that part of the history, but I'm doing it, in my own way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you're using it to make collages too. And my understanding is that you're putting these materials together, different sorts of materials. Is that right?
Yeah. The materials are, up to this point, always printed on paper or muslin or sometimes canvas drop cloth. And the materials sort of stay the same in that range thus far. but I'm always changing the color of the inks or the pressure. I hand print all of my prints, meaning I don't use a print shop where I'm rolling the prints through a press. I'm using a wooden kitchen spoon and just burnishing the prints by hand. So I get a lot of variation from the prints because of that technique.
Cool. And when you're conceiving or conceptualizing an idea, maybe you already answered this, but where do you start? Does it start with an image like a photograph, or does it start with meditation or music? Like, where does it begin?
Yeah, it often starts with an image, and usually the image is a photo that I've taken. It could be a photo that I found from a family member on Facebook or Instagram, or it may not be a family member. It may be a found photo, an image that I found that reminds me of the characteristics of a family member. And then I find a way to intervene on that photo of the stranger and kind of make it more familiar in the same way that I have sort of made family in my life. So I have, before reconnecting with my family, and something I learned from my mother is that your family is your friends, your neighbors, the people who take care of you and the people who care for you. And in some ways, that's what I do to those found photos. I find a way to make them more familiar in order to kind of like increase my family.
Oh, that's nice. That's a nice way of looking at that.
Yeah.
And when you're creating the piece itself, do you begin with the final image in mind and then imagine the collage, or do you build the layers in your mind and then the final image?
Yeah, so it does go back and forth. So I'll start with the image in mind, and I usually will use Photoshop. I'll bring the image in, I'll play with it in Photoshop, print it out, draw on top of the printout. I'm making a lot of drawing choices, and I'm making decisions on how I will break it down into pieces of paper. I'm more so thinking like a builder. How would a sculptor begin to sculpt this image if it were 3D, right? So it goes back to that idea of, that ability to carve or be a carpenter and be a sculptor. So I'm sort of thinking more like a sculptor than anything. And from there, I enlarge it onto the canvas, and then I am attaching paper to the canvas to collage. But when I do that, the paper sort of reveals that there's more three-dimensional illusionistic space in the picture frame than I could have originally imagined. So I have to start responding to that space. So I always deviate from the original plan. The drawing is kind of a way to build my confidence so that, I don't chicken out and I start the piece. But then once I get going, then new things happen, and then I kind of start responding to what the piece says it wants to be.
Is there ever a conflict between the idea that you started with and where the piece seems to be taking you?
Yeah, I mean, that's the good part. To me, that's one of the things that I need for the piece to have a life of its own outside of my own assumptions or my own intentions for it. So usually that's how I know a piece is done, is when I've learned something from it. Making. If it can put me in a position where I have to respond to it and do something that might be uncomfortable or new or challenging, then that's one of the things that I know it's doing. It has a life of its own that I have to then respond to. Right.
Yeah. Is there ever any, I don't know, not conflict, but apprehension in displaying these family members to a public that doesn't know them at all?
Yeah, at first I was concerned because I was unsure of my family's participation, how much they wanted that kind of exposure. But when I asked permission, they gave it. And like I said, now they're so excited that they just, now they're on my back to I have so many cousins that feel left out and can't wait for their portrait to be made. So, no, at this point, it's exciting for me to do it and to share that work with the public, because the work is about representation. These are images of people that do not get often represented in the genre of portraiture. So it's exciting to intervene on that genre and give my family that kind of light and platform.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
What happens when a 21-year-old college student from a small town in Kansas, who's never even before stepped foot in a big American city, decides to hop on a plane and spend her summer in Paris, France? Well, that's what award-winning student journalist Abby Riffle just did. And, lucky for us, she recorded her experiences along the way, beginning a month before she left and ending a month after she got back. Abby will take you along for the ride in the brand new podcast, A Broadening My Horizons, on Paris Underground Radio. Available wherever you find your favorite podcasts. We'll be right back with City of Muses after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to City of Muses on Paris Underground Radio. And you're here in Paris at the moment for a very specific reason. You have a new exhibit coming up called Building Our Being. Is that right?
That's right. Building Our Being.
Can you tell us the story of that name?
Yeah, the title has come out of this kind of work of creating portraits that are also about navigating identities and how identity is constructed. And again, remember, I mentioned how the work itself kind of forces me to respond to it through, even challenging my own assumptions about what it should be. And in a lot of ways, that's how identity operates for us, right? As people, we see ourselves one way, but then we walk into a room and we might be interpreted another way, or through a conversation, you notice that someone is responding differently or in a certain way. And you see identity shifting, and you realize that it's not objective and solidified, but identities are certainly constructed, but they're constructed from not just our own beliefs, but the beliefs in our environment and the materials of our environment. The access to what is around us is in our identities. So building our being is really about how that negotiation of building one's identity and then also responding to the environment, and how we can never separate our bodies from the environment around us, and how that so much of our environment informs who we are as well.
And was this the theme that you had been exploring and then created the pieces around, or the other way around?
Well, it's kind of a theme that I've been exploring for a while, right? But it's every time I do the work, it really kind of opens up sort of like new chapters for me. And I think the chapter for this show has really been about this process I mentioned to you just moments ago, about finding a photo that speaks to me, that reminds me of something very familiar, or maybe a family member or a close friend, and then finding a way to intervene on the photo and sort of make it into a family member, or bring in characteristics from family members, bring in attitudes or gestures or likenesses or facial features from family members. So they become these sort of hybrid identities. So that's sort of the new steps that I'm taking in building our being.
I love that. That's so interesting. When you're talking about creating art around people who are underrepresented, and I think, a lot of these people are African-American, this African-American experience. So I wanted to ask you about your experience of being an African-American artist abroad, because correct me if I'm wrong, I have no idea, but my assumption is that if you're showing your art in America, especially in a major metropolitan city, we all have the same basic language, basic lexicon around some framework for what an African-American experience is. So I'm wondering, when you take that art overseas and the people that are in front of this art maybe have never had a firsthand experience and their references come from pop culture, do you find that non-American audiences respond differently than American ones?
Well, of course, because we know that race means different things in different countries, right? So the context for sure changes, and I'm interested in that change. I'm interested in the translation of race or identity, in different cultures and different settings. Of course, this is what I mean is this is a part of identity, is that you can kind of step into a situation with one notion of who you are and then be received very differently. I mean, this has happened to me throughout my life. I don't know, this is audio, so viewers can't see me, but I'm biracial. My father is Black, African American. My mother is white, second generation, German and Polish. I'm very light skinned, but I grew up on the south side of Chicago, predominantly Black neighborhood. So I have a lot of diverse experiences, but also often not sure how I will be interpreted by others. So this has been something I've been hyper aware of for a long time in my life, but it really has informed my practice in realizing that identity is something that is, again, it's not objective, and it's sort of constantly being interpreted. One thing that I make strong efforts toward in a show like this, and the gallery Zidoun-Bossuyt has been very welcoming of the strategy, is to write and display more context behind the work. So even here in the gallery, there's wall text that, typically you won't see that in a gallery structure. You might see that in a museum, but we have some didactic wall text that gives some context to the work. It talks about the location of Detroit, which of course may be unfamiliar to a Parisian audience. And we talk about, Detroit as the heartbeat of the American economy at one point, and how much of that economy had an industrial boom due to the labor of African Americans in the auto plants and the auto industry there. And my family, as a result of that migration from the South to the Midwest for those jobs. So a lot of that context, I realize some of the joy of the work has been in really, just being more explicit, I guess, about some of that context for a Parisian audience who that might be new to them, or they may know all of it, but it's also good to just put it in a tight language, I think.
That was going to be my next question, is whether you felt the need to explain more to an audience that doesn't necessarily understand.
Yeah, that's the thing as an artist, right? Is like the need to explain comes and goes. Right? I mean, there are certainly things about the work that I do want to protect and I do want to create context around. But I also want to leave it open. I also want to hear from the audience sometimes their own interpretations. I mean, as an artist, I always get the question when I'm introducing work to new audience they say, well, what is this about? Or tell me about your work, right? I think a lot of artists hear that. And my favorite thing to do is to reverse that and say, I would love for you to tell me about the work, because I think I learned so much about my work by inviting others into it. And then I get, it's kind of like a mad scientist role. It's like step into the laboratory so that we can test and see what this is that we're making. So I sort of appreciate my practice as like a constant learning experience for me, even as the maker. So yeah, I mean, mainly I'm interested in, sharing that with more people.
How much do you consider the space between the artwork and the viewer when you're creating the piece?
It's a great question. I understand that my artwork will leave the studio and there will be people standing in front of it who I don't know, and I don't know what their thoughts are. So what I try to do is add as much of my own interest into my work, and then also feel that I've left enough entry points and room for the viewer as well. So it's a bit of a a dance between caring and not caring. And of course, I enjoy, people seeing the work. But to be honest, I make the work that I have to make for my own soul. I've always been an artist before I knew anyone cared. And I'll always be an artist. So for me, I have to be really excited and happy about what I do primarily. And then once I'm taken care of in that way, then I don't really mind, what the other interpretations are there. It's kind of like when you get dressed in the morning and you look good, you're like, hey, look, if someone doesn't like the outfit, I don't care at this point. I think this is my favorite outfit, So I think that's kind of like how I feel about the work.
That's beautiful. Yeah, it's like a bonus.
It's well dressed to go into the world and take criticism.
So you're here in Paris now. How many times have you been here before?
6 fois ou 7 fois.
That was a very French, you did it. Very good.
I studied in France after I finished my undergrad degree. I met our only Black faculty member, Patrick Betaudier, who was Trinidadian, and he took a handful of students to Montflanquin, which is in the South France, right above the Pyrenees Mountains. And we studied Italian Renaissance oil painting there for 6 months.
Wow.
And I don't know if you've ever been to that region, but time moves very slow there. It's the country, and it's the French country, and it's wine region, it's Bordeaux region. So time is very, very chill. And we did a lot of painting and a lot of thinking, and I fell in love with it. And I went back for another 6 months following. So I stayed long enough to speak very bad French, but what I did learn is that France was a place that I wanted to return to. And of course, I always had a soft spot for France because it was there that I decided that I would become a professional artist. And I didn't know what that meant, but I had definitely had a more romantic notion of it in my mind then, because I was drinking great wine and
that'll help.
And eating great food in the south of France. And that's not what it's like in New York at all, but it's still a lot of fun.
That leads me really naturally to my next question. There are a lot of French artists who've been influenced by other cultures. Immediately, you could think of Monet with the Japanese and Gauguin with the Polynesians.
Van Gogh, Japanese as well, right?
Yeah. So do you find that your work has been influenced by the places that you traveled and maybe by France itself?
Well, yes. I mean, France, again, that for me experientially really opened up my sense of art history, especially in studying Italian Renaissance oil painting, which is such a rich genre. So that really kind of started me on this journey of really seeing art history as a real lived experience. I think for me, travel is also necessary in not thinking about art, if that makes sense. It's also necessary as a way to cleanse the palate and to really just take in new ways of thinking, new ways of eating, new ways of seeing that are not about necessarily translating them into the art, but they're maybe just a way to take a break from yourself.
In France, you'll need the expert guidance of Gail Boisclair and Marie Pistinier, hosts of the Paris A State of Mind podcast. Listen now to Paris A State of Mind on parisundergroundradio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with City of Muses after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to City of Muses on Paris Underground Radio. So, can you remind our listeners where they can find your exhibit, Building Our Being, and when?
Listeners, you have to come see the show. We're here at Zidoun-Bossuyt Gallery, and the gallery is beautiful. This is the second show that I've done with Zidoun-Bossuyt. First one that I've done with them here in the Paris gallery. But I'm so excited to share it. And the opening is the 21st, 6 p.m.
Fabulous. I'm going to include links to all of that so people can come check out the show really easily. I obviously also encourage everyone to go. I will be going myself. Where can people follow you if they want to keep up to date with what you're doing in your world?
For me, I mean, the best thing is Instagram. They can see me at Yashua Red. So that's at my first name in the color red. That's where I post all the stuff. So yeah, please follow me there.
Excellent. I'll leave a link to that as well. Thank you so much, Yashua. It was wonderful speaking with you. Thank you for taking the time.
You too, Jennifer. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to City of Muses. If you've liked what you heard, please take a moment to rate and review it. This is the fastest and easiest way to help support the podcast. Tell a friend who could use a little inspiration. You can also subscribe to the Paris Underground Radio newsletter over on our website, parisundergroundradio.com, which comes out every Sunday and gives a little peek into what's on the network for the week ahead. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity. You can find me on all socials at Jennyphoria. That's JennyPhoria. Thank you for listening, and may you find inspiration wherever you go. City of Muses was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio.